The first thing my boss did was slide a $20 bill across his desk. Not my final paycheck. Not reimbursement. A 20. He pushed it toward me like he was doing me a favor. "You should probably buy yourself a decent outfit before your next interview," he said. People notice these things. The room went silent. The HR manager stared down at her notebook. My coworkers standing outside the glass office pretended not to watch. I looked at the wrinkled bill, then back at Richard Lawson. He smiled. Not kindly. The kind of smile someone wears when they think they've already won. Then he said the sentence that changed both of our lives. "I can't have someone this financially unstable representing my company." I quietly picked up the $20 bill, folded it once, slipped it into my purse, and walked out without saying a single word. Richard thought he'd fired the poorest employee in the company. He had no idea he had just fired the woman whose family owned the building his company had occupied for nearly 27 years. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 36 years old and I live in Chicago. I worked as a senior facilities coordinator for Lawson Commercial Consulting, a regional business advisory firm occupying 6 floors of a downtown office tower. My job wasn't glamorous. I coordinated maintenance projects, negotiated vendor contracts, managed office renovations, and made sure 600 employees had a workplace that actually functioned. Most people never noticed me unless something broke. I liked it that way. I wasn't interested in office politics. I just wanted to do my job well and go home. Home happened to be a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city. At least that's what everyone believed. The truth was a little more complicated. My father had spent his entire life investing in commercial real estate. He hated flashy cars, designer suits, and country clubs. He believed buildings should make money quietly while their owners lived ordinary lives. When he passed away 4 years earlier, my younger brother Ethan and I inherited several properties through a family trust. One of those properties was the 12-story office building where I worked. Hardly anyone knew. Not because it was a secret, because we never talked about it. The building wasn't owned by Natalie Brooks. It was owned by Brooks Family Property Holdings, managed through an independent commercial management company. We intentionally kept ownership separate from tenants. My father believed landlords who interfered with tenants created unnecessary problems. So I remained just another employee. Even the property manager handling the building rarely met us in person. Everything went through attorneys and asset managers. That separation had worked perfectly. Until Richard Lawson decided my bank account somehow reflected my value as a person. 3 months before he fired me, my life looked perfectly ordinary. I drove a 10-year-old Honda, packed my own lunches, bought clothes only when I actually needed them. Not because I couldn't afford more. Because I genuinely didn't care. After losing Dad, expensive things had stopped impressing me. Quiet mornings, good coffee, and weekends with Ethan mattered much more. Unfortunately, appearances mattered a great deal to Richard. He became CEO the year before after purchasing a controlling interest in the consulting firm from its retiring founders. He was 48, polished, charismatic, and obsessed with image. Everything had to look successful. The lobby flowers, the furniture, the coffee machines, even the employees. If clients see confidence, he'd often say, they assume competence. Most people nodded. I usually stayed quiet. The first uncomfortable moment happened during a quarterly staff breakfast. Richard looked around the room complimenting people's watches, handbags, and suits. Then he stopped beside my chair. "Natalie." I looked up. "When are we going to upgrade your wardrobe?" Several people laughed awkwardly. I smiled politely. "When my current one wears out." He chuckled. "I like your sense of humor." I wasn't joking. A few coworkers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Rachel Kim from accounting caught my eye across the room. She gave me a tiny sympathetic smile. At the time I thought Richard was simply insensitive. I hadn't yet realized he was paying much closer attention to my personal life than any boss should. About 6 weeks later, I arrived late for the first time in nearly 2 years. Only 12 minutes. My car battery had died. When I finally reached the office, Richard happened to be walking through reception. "Traffic. My battery." He glanced toward the parking garage. "Maybe it's time to buy something more reliable. I'll replace the battery this afternoon." He nodded slowly. Sometimes saving money ends up costing more. It sounded harmless, but there was something in his tone that stayed with me, like he wasn't talking about my car anymore. The comments became more frequent after that. You still bring lunch every day? You don't belong to the fitness club across the street? That's the same winter coat from last year, isn't it? None of the questions affected my work. None of them belonged in the workplace either. Rachel finally confronted me one afternoon while we organized invoices. Has Richard always talked to you like that? I shrugged. It's annoying. It's inappropriate. I know. Are you going to report it? I smiled. To HR? HR reports to Richard. She sighed. Good point. We laughed, but neither of us found it funny. A week later I discovered something stranger. I'd applied internally for an operations manager position. I'd exceeded every qualification. 5 years with the company. Excellent performance reviews. Consistently under budget on every major facilities project. The hiring committee never interviewed me. Instead, the position went to someone with half my experience. Afterward, HR Director Melissa quietly stopped by my desk. I shouldn't be telling you this. Telling me what? You weren't rejected because of your qualifications. I frowned. Then why? She looked around to make sure no one was listening. Richard thinks management should project financial success. I stared at her. What does that even mean? She hesitated. He said clients expect leaders to look prosperous. I almost laughed. So because I drive an older car. I didn't hear the whole conversation. But he mentioned appearances several times. Melissa looked genuinely embarrassed. I'm sorry. That evening I told Ethan about it over dinner. He nearly dropped his fork. He's serious? I wish he wasn't. You could quit. I like my job. He leaned back in his chair. You know, Dad would have found this hilarious. I smiled. He would have said a building doesn't care what shoes you're wearing. Exactly. Dad judged people by how they treated janitors, receptionists, and waiters. Not by watches. Not by cars. Certainly not by designer labels. Sometimes I wondered what he'd think of Richard. I had a feeling he'd know exactly who he was within 5 minutes. 2 weeks later, our biggest client scheduled an office visit. Richard spent days preparing. Fresh flowers. New artwork. Custom pastries. Everyone received an email reminding us to wear executive-level attire. I wore my usual navy blazer. It was clean. Professional. Perfectly appropriate. Apparently Richard disagreed. Just before the clients arrived, he stopped me near the conference rooms. Natalie. Yes. Can I see you in my office? The moment the door closed, he looked me up and down. You ignored my email. I followed the dress code. You followed the minimum. I blinked. I'm sorry. He opened a drawer and removed a glossy department store catalog. This company has an image. I stared at the catalog. I don't understand. You represent Lawson Consulting every time someone sees you. My work speaks for itself. He smiled thinly. Clients notice more than work. I left his office confused and more than a little offended. But I still believe that would be the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 days later, someone anonymously left a luxury clothing store gift card on my desk. There was no note. No signature. Just a card worth $500. I immediately walked it to HR. Melissa looked uncomfortable the moment she saw it. You know where this came from, don't you? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I placed it on her desk. I'm returning it. She sighed. I figured you would. As I walked back toward my office, I noticed Richard watching from the far end of the hallway. He looked disappointed. Not because I'd refused the gift. Because I hadn't accepted the message that came with it. I had no idea that by the end of the week, he would decide there was only one way to solve what he believed was my image problem. And that decision would cost him far more than he ever imagined. By Friday morning, I had almost convinced myself Richard would eventually lose interest. I was wrong. At 9:15, Melissa from HR appeared beside my desk. Natalie, Richard would like to see you. Her voice was unusually quiet. She wouldn't look me in the eyes. That was my first clue something was different. As I walked toward the executive offices, I noticed several coworkers watching me. Rachel stood near the copier with a worried expression. She mouthed, "Call me later." I smiled to reassure her. I wish I hadn't. Richard didn't invite me to sit down. He remained standing behind his desk, hands folded. Melissa sat off to one side with a folder in front of her. The atmosphere felt strangely formal. "Natalie," Richard began, "this is a difficult conversation." I had heard those words before. They almost never led anywhere good. "Okay." He took a slow breath. "We're restructuring." I frowned. My department wasn't notified. "This decision concerns one position. Mine." I already knew. Still I asked, "My position?" "Yes." I looked at Melissa. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. Richard continued, "Your role is being eliminated." That made no sense. I managed maintenance for 6 floors. There wasn't another employee doing my job. So, who's taking over my projects? We'll redistribute responsibilities. He answered too quickly. Prepared. Rehearsed. I asked one more question. Is this about performance? No. My reviews. Excellent. The budget. Outstanding. Then why am I being terminated? Richard leaned forward. Between us. He lowered his voice. Our clients expect a certain standard from everyone they interact with. I stared at him. I'm a facilities coordinator. You also attend vendor meetings. I waited. He finally said it. You present an image of financial struggle. For a moment I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. I'm sorry. I've tried helping. The gift card. The wardrobe suggestions. The career advice. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You think being frugal makes me unqualified? I think perception matters. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Richard wasn't finished. Our leadership team needs employees who project success. I looked directly at him. My financial situation has never affected my work. He smiled politely. That's your opinion. Then came the $20 bill. He removed it from his wallet and slid it across the desk. You'll need lunch while you're job hunting. Neither Melissa nor I spoke. He actually believed this was kindness. I slowly picked it up, folded it, placed it inside my purse. Anything else? Richard looked surprised. I expected more emotion. I've learned not to argue with people who've already made up their minds. He shrugged. I genuinely wish you well. I nodded once, then walked out. The office fell silent as I carried my small box toward the elevator. Rachel hurried after me. Natalie. I stopped. What happened? I'll tell you later. She looked inside the box. That's it. My coffee mug. A notebook. My plant. She frowned. That's your whole desk? I never liked clutter. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. I hugged her. It's okay. No, it isn't. She was right. It wasn't. When I reached the parking garage, my phone rang. Ethan. I just got your text. I've been fired. I know. I'll be okay. I know. There was a pause. Then he asked quietly, do they know? No. They never figured it out? No. He laughed once. A very short laugh. Dad would have called that poetic. I leaned against my car. I'm not interested in revenge. I didn't say revenge. I know what you're thinking. I'm thinking our largest tenant just fired one of the building owners. I closed my eyes. Ethan. I'm serious. So am I. We don't interfere with tenants. We never have. And Dad made us promise we never would. He sighed. I remember. That promise mattered. The building existed to generate income. Not ego. Not leverage. Not personal battles. I don't want to become the kind of person Richard already thinks I am. You won't. We ended the call. I drove home believing the story was over. It wasn't even close. Monday morning, my personal attorney, Karen Ellis, called. Natalie, do you have a minute? Of course. The asset management company requested approval. For what? The loss and lease renewal. I had completely forgotten. Their 10-year commercial lease expired in 3 months. The property manager had negotiated a renewal weeks earlier. All ownership signatures were needed before the documents became final. Karen continued. They're asking whether you'd like to proceed. I sat quietly. The timing felt almost unreal. Friday I lost my job. Monday I was being asked to approve the company's future tenancy. I don't make tenant decisions. I know. That's why we hired Harbor Property Management. They're requesting guidance because of recent developments. Someone new. Probably the property manager. News traveled quickly. What are my options? Karen answered carefully. You can approve. You can reject. Or request additional review. I thought about Dad. He'd always separated business from emotion. What would Dad do? Karen smiled softly. He'd review the numbers. That afternoon Ethan drove to my apartment carrying a cardboard archive box. I found these in Dad's storage unit. Inside were old property files, building photographs, original construction plans, lease histories, letters. One folder immediately caught my attention. Lawson Commercial Consulting. I opened it. The first lease agreement was dated 27 years earlier. Signed by Richard's father. Not Richard. His father, Thomas Lawson. Dad had handwritten a note on the inside cover. Asterisk honest man. Pays early. Treat fairly. Asterisk. Another note appeared years later. Asterisk Richard seems ambitious. Watch expansion carefully. Asterisk. I smiled sadly. Dad had trusted people. But he also paid attention. As Ethan organized the files, something unexpected slipped from the folder. A handwritten letter. Not from Dad. From Thomas Lawson. Richard's father. It thanked my father for allowing temporary rent deferrals during an economic downturn nearly 20 years earlier. The final paragraph caught my attention. Asterisk, you saved this company when no bank would help us. My family will never forget your generosity. Asterisk. I read it twice. Richard clearly hadn't. The next morning, Harbor Property Management requested a meeting. Their senior manager, David Chun, arrived with 2 binders. He'd managed our building for almost 15 years. Natalie, I'm sorry about your job. Thank you. He opened the first binder. I assume this complicates things. It shouldn't. I agree. He hesitated. There's something else. He handed me a tenant performance report. Lawson Consulting had been paying rent late. Not once. Repeatedly. 6 late payments in the last 12 months. I frowned. That's unusual. It gets worse. He turned another page. Several maintenance invoices requested by Lawson had never been approved. Yet contractors had billed the building anyway. Someone inside Lawson had authorized work they weren't permitted to authorize. Nearly $200,000. I stared at David. Who signed them? He slid one invoice across the table. There it was. Richard Lawson. My stomach tightened. I've never seen these. You wouldn't. They bypassed normal approval channels. David folded his hands. Our auditors only caught it during the lease renewal review. I looked at the stack of invoices again. Suddenly my firing didn't feel personal anymore. Felt strategic. As if Richard wanted someone gone before these documents surfaced. Then David quietly added the sentence that changed everything. There's one signature on these approvals that doesn't belong to Richard. I looked down. The second signature was from someone inside Lawson Consulting. Someone I knew very well. Melissa, the HR director. I looked at Melissa's signature 3 times before I accepted what I was seeing. There was no mistake. It was hers. Every invoice carried Richard's approval, followed by Melissa's witness signature. The date stretched back almost a year. I leaned back in my chair. Why would HR be signing facilities invoices? David shook his head. She shouldn't have been. Was she authorized? No. Did Richard have authority? Only for improvements inside the lease space. And only after receiving written approval from property management. We never approved these? David slid another folder toward me. Not a single one. A cold feeling settled over me. Someone had ordered expensive renovations, approved payment requests, and acted as though the building owner would simply absorb the costs. Until now, nobody had connected all the paperwork. What kind of renovations? I asked. David opened a spreadsheet. Executive offices. Custom furniture. Private conference suite. High-end security system. Imported marble finishes. I frowned. I've worked in that office for 5 years. We never installed marble. David nodded. Exactly. What? We inspected yesterday. My heartbeat quickened. Those renovations don't exist. I stared at him. So, where did the money go? David closed the binder. That's what our auditors are trying to determine. Ethan let out a slow whistle. So someone billed the building for work that never happened. David nodded. That appears to be the case. And Richard signed everything? Yes. I looked back at the invoices. Each contractor had a different company name, different addresses, different contact numbers. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. Until David handed me one final report. Our accounting team noticed something unusual. The contractors all shared the same mailing address. A small mailbox rental downtown. My phone buzzed. Rachel. I excused myself and answered. Natalie. Her voice sounded anxious. Are you okay? I'm fine. You won't believe what's happening here. What happened? Richard called an emergency company meeting. My stomach tightened. What did he say? He told everyone layoffs were necessary because the landlord suddenly became unreasonable. I blinked. The landlord. He's blaming the building owners. I almost laughed. He says rent is increasing dramatically, and the company might have to relocate. David looked up when he saw my expression. What is it? I covered the phone. He's blaming us. David sighed. I was afraid of that. Rachel continued. People are scared. I understand. Some think the company could close. That wasn't true. No rent increase had even been proposed. Richard was creating a story before anyone learned the real one. Before I could answer, Rachel lowered her voice. There's something else. What? I found Melissa crying in the parking garage. That surprised me. Crying. She kept saying, I never thought he'd let it go this far. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? I don't know. Did she say anything else? Rachel hesitated. She told me if anyone asks. She never wanted you fired. After the call ended, David looked thoughtful. If Melissa's scared, she knows something. I think so too. He closed both binders. Our forensic accountants should have preliminary results tomorrow. I stood. I'd like copies of everything. They're already prepared. Dad had always believed that facts mattered more than emotions. For the first time since being fired, I understood exactly what he meant. The next afternoon my attorney called. Natalie. We have a problem. What happened? Richard's attorney contacted Harbor Property Management. I frowned. About the lease? No. Then what? He requested an emergency purchase meeting. A purchase. Richard wants to buy the building. I actually laughed. He can't. He doesn't know that. What do you mean? He believes the owners are a private investment group willing to sell. I looked at Ethan. He was already smiling. Dad had never put our names on public ownership records. Very few tenants knew who actually owned the property. Richard still had no idea. 2 days later we watched the meeting through a secure conference room, used by Harbor Property Management. Not to spy. Simply because ownership had the legal right to observe negotiations. Richard arrived in an expensive navy suit. Confident. Relaxed. He shook David's hand. I think we can make a deal. David remained professional. What kind of deal? I'll purchase the property. David asked calmly. Why? Richard smiled. I think ownership has become unstable. Ethan nearly choked trying not to laugh. Richard continued. I've built this business. I deserve control over the building. David simply took notes. Then Richard added something that made my stomach turn. The current owners don't understand business. He had no idea the people he was insulting were listening from the next room. The meeting ended without any agreement. As Richard walked out, David joined us. He still doesn't know. No. He assumes he'll pressure ownership into selling. I looked through the glass wall toward the empty conference room. He still believes appearances are everything. David nodded. Our accountants finished. He handed me the final forensic report. The missing renovation money had not gone to contractors. It had gone into 3 shell companies. Each company eventually transferred money into one personal account. Account holder: Richard Lawson. Total amount: $2,486,000. I stared at the number. Nearly $2.5 million. Just then Karen called again. Natalie, I have another update. Please tell me it gets better. It does. Our investigators found emails. What kind? Melissa kept copies. My heart skipped. Copies of what? Richard instructed her to terminate you before the lease renewal review. Silence. He actually wrote that? Karen answered quietly. His exact words were. She opened the email. Remove Natalie Brooks before ownership starts asking questions. She's too involved with building operations. Every hair on my arm stood up. Richard hadn't fired me because he thought I was poor. Not entirely. He fired me because I knew the building. I understood vendors, invoices, maintenance, permits. Without realizing it, I was the one employee most likely to notice the fraud. The comments about my clothes, my old car, my packed lunches, those were real. He genuinely judged me for them. But they also gave him a convenient excuse. He had hidden a calculated decision behind a personal prejudice. And now there was written proof. I was still processing the email when Karen said one more thing. Natalie. What? The board of Lawson Consulting has called an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. What for? They've invited the building owners. I exchanged a look with Ethan. For the first time in 27 years, the owners wouldn't be sending lawyers. We would be attending in person. The boardroom was quieter than I expected. No raised voices. No reporters. No dramatic confrontations. Just 12 people sitting around a long walnut table, each with a binder in front of them. Richard stood near the windows, confidently talking with 2 board members. He hadn't noticed Ethan and me yet. Most of the directors hadn't either. David Chun from Harbor Property Management greeted us first. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. Mr. Brooks. His voice carried just enough that everyone turned. Richard glanced over his shoulder. For a second he simply looked confused. Then his eyes settled on me. Natalie. I smiled politely. Good morning, Richard. He frowned. What are you doing here? Before I could answer, the chairman of the board, Harold Simmons, stood. I believe there has been some confusion. He looked around the room. I'd like to introduce Natalie Brooks and Ethan Brooks, beneficiaries of the Brooks Family Property Trust. Richard still looked puzzled. Harold continued. They are the owners of this building. The room became completely silent. Richard laughed once. A nervous, disbelieving laugh. That's not possible. David calmly placed the property ownership documents in front of every board member. It is. Richard stared at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers. His face slowly lost its color. You. I nodded. Yes. You never said. You never asked. There wasn't any anger in my voice anymore. Just facts. He looked genuinely shaken. You worked here. I did. For 5 years. Yes. You owned the building the entire time? My family did. He sat down heavily without saying another word. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked completely unprepared. Harold cleared his throat. We have 2 matters to discuss. He opened the first binder. The lease. Then the second. The forensic audit. Richard immediately interrupted. I've already explained the accounting discrepancies. Harold looked at him calmly. No. You explained them before the investigation. He slid copies of the audit across the table. Our independent accountants reached a different conclusion. One by one the directors flipped through the report. No one spoke. The numbers spoke loudly enough. Unauthorized invoices. Shell companies. Transfers. Personal accounts. Missing funds. Every transaction was supported by bank records. Every signature had been verified. Every payment had been traced. There wasn't much left to argue about. Richard finally looked at me. You planned this. I blinked. Planned what? You got yourself fired. Several people at the table looked at him in disbelief. I answered quietly. You fired me because you believed I was poor. You never corrected me. I never thought my personal finances were relevant to my job. They weren't. Apparently they were. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no answer. Harold turned toward Melissa. She had barely spoken since the meeting began. Miss Grant, did you authorize these invoices? Her hands trembled. No. But your signature appears on every one. I signed where Richard told me to sign. Richard immediately interrupted. She's lying. Melissa looked at him for the first time. No. Her voice cracked. I'm done protecting you. She reached into her bag. I brought everything. The room froze. She placed a flash drive on the table. I kept copies. Richard stood up. What did you do? Melissa ignored him. I saved every email. Every instruction. Every revised invoice. Every deleted budget. She looked directly at the board. I was afraid. Then she looked at me. I'm sorry. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It didn't erase what she'd done. But it was honest. The company's outside counsel reviewed the files over the next 2 hours. No one left the room. By lunchtime, the conclusion was unavoidable. Richard had created fake renovation projects through shell companies he secretly controlled. Melissa had helped process paperwork but had never received any of the money. She had made terrible decisions. Richard had made criminal ones. The board voted immediately. His employment was terminated effective that day. His access to company systems was revoked before he even left the building. Outside counsel notified federal authorities and the Financial Crimes Division before the meeting ended. Richard walked out carrying the same kind of cardboard box I'd carried just weeks earlier. The difference was simple. Mine held a coffee mug and a plant. His contained the consequences of his own choices. After the meeting, Harold asked if Ethan and I would stay. We'd like to discuss the lease. Ethan looked at me. Dad's words echoed in my mind. Treat good tenants fairly. Judge businesses by facts, not emotions. I looked around the table. Richard was gone. The employees he'd led were still here. Hundreds of them. People like Rachel. Receptionists. Accountants. Maintenance staff. None of them had fired me. None of them deserved to lose their jobs because of one executive. I smiled. The Brooks Trust will honor the renewal. Several directors looked surprised. No rent increase? I shook my head. The agreement your team negotiated was fair. Harold let out a long breath. Thank you. I do have one condition. What is it? The next CEO should value character more than appearances. For the first time that morning, several people laughed. Not because it was funny, because they knew exactly why I had said it. 3 months later, Lawson Consulting had a new leadership team. The company issued a public statement acknowledging accounting failures, strengthening financial oversight, and apologizing to employees affected by the previous administration. I received a personal letter from the new CEO, not asking me to return, simply thanking me for cooperating with the investigation and helping prevent the company from collapsing. Rachel stayed with the company. She called me one afternoon. You'll never believe this. What? They removed every executive parking space. I laughed. Why? The new CEO says respect isn't measured by where you park. I couldn't help smiling. Sounds like a better place already. It is. Melissa accepted responsibility for her role and cooperated fully with investigators. Because she had preserved evidence and assisted prosecutors, she avoided prison but lost her HR certification. Several months later, she wrote me a handwritten letter. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply admitted that staying silent had been easier than doing the right thing. I respected the honesty. Whether I forgave her wasn't as important as the fact that she'd finally stopped protecting the wrong person. As for Richard, the civil lawsuits came first. The criminal charges followed. The evidence he'd once believed no one would ever connect had been sitting in spreadsheets, invoices, and emails all along. He underestimated paperwork. He underestimated accountants. And he underestimated the quiet employee who spent 5 years making sure buildings worked properly. One afternoon, nearly a year later, I was walking through the lobby when the security guard smiled. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks." I smiled back. It still felt strange hearing my last name in that building. A young maintenance technician recognized me. "I heard you used to work here." I did. "What department?" "Facilities." He grinned. "So, you went from employee to owner?" I laughed. "Actually, it happened the other way around." He looked confused. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. People sometimes ask why I never told anyone I owned the building. The answer is simple. Because I wanted people to show me who they were before they knew what I had. Richard looked at an old car, homemade lunches, and inexpensive clothes and decided I had less value than everyone else. He never bothered to learn who I was. If he had, he would have discovered something my father taught me long before I inherited a single property. Real wealth isn't measured by the building you own. It's revealed by how you treat the people who walk through its doors.